Well, it looks to me like you guys were able to guess from my oh-so-vague hint at the end of my Peanuts video that my next big project would be the MGM cartoons. And I thought I was being so subtle! Curses! But anyway, yes, MGM is next on the chopping block. There's a little over 400 cartoons here, so we should be able to get through all these in about 4 parts. And of course, a final ranking video at the end. And this will be rather interesting because I actually didn't grow up with any of these cartoons outside of some Tom and Jerry ones. So I was really looking forward to this cartoon series in particular, simply because a lot of it would be new to me, and I'm looking forward to finally watching some of these classics for the very first time, as well as maybe, hopefully discovering some hidden gems. Okay, so before we really dive in, we need to go over a couple of housekeeping items first. Let's start with the easy stuff. First of all, don't expect me to go super in-depth on some of these. These reviews aren't going to be anywhere near as long as my Peanuts reviews, although I don't think anybody expected that. Consider this more of an overview of the cartoons in question, much like my Looney Tunes series. And just like with the Looney Tunes video, some of the video quality in the clips I'm going to show is going to be not that good, to say the very least. I tried to get the best quality footage that I could find, but some of these don't have any good quality footage, or at least none that I could find. Turns out for good reason in some cases. Yeah, there are some cartoons that MGM has really tried to forget that they had a hand in and have tried to bury. Well, I'm going to Indiana Jones these old relics and put them on blast for all to see. Okay, I kid, but as noted in my Looney Tunes video, these cartoons being reviewed are very much a product of the time and need to be viewed in its proper historical context, yada yada yada, you know the drill by this point. My job is to review these cartoons in as unbiased a manner as humanly possible, reviewing them and taking the time periods these were released into account. I'm not going to dock points just because a cartoon throws in a quick blackface gag, nor am I going to point them out every time one appears because, let's be honest, we'd be here all day if I did. Of course, cartoons that are drenched in them, yeah, we'll take those on a case-by-case basis. But we're all adults here, so I think we can discuss the racial politics of cartoons that are almost a century old without devolving into flame bait. Right?
Right.
Also, while I tried to find as accurate release dates as humanly possible, because of how old and obscure some of these cartoons are, a few of them, particularly the John Sutherland cartoons, I could not find any release dates for, other than the year that it came out. Maybe there's some obscure document or newspaper hidden in the back corners of the internet that has the correct information, but frankly, I'm not interested in perusing old documents for endless hours trying to find it. I'm just going to give my best estimate. Also, extremely pertinent for this video, for simplicity's sake, every studio that MGM outsourced for cartoons is getting their own section. So if some of the cartoons are presented a little out of order chronologically, that's the reason why. And finally, here are a few things that will not be included in this review series, just in case somebody asked. Stuff or Stuff. It was a pro-capitalist Cold War era documentary made by MGM. It has a lot of animation in it, but it's a documentary short, so it doesn't really belong in this series. I will also not be taking a look at the A Few Quick Facts series. None of these were released in theaters because they were cartoons commissioned by the US military for soldiers during World War II. I'll talk about this series when I get around to doing the Private Snafu video. And since I have your guys' undivided attention, I feel like now's the perfect opportunity to talk to you guys about a very important political topic that I've had on my mind for quite some time.
Get on with it!
Yes, get on with it! Get on with it!
Okay. Boy, you bring up politics and everyone gets all testy. Alright, before we get started, as always, a quick thank you to my patrons over on Patreon. And a special shout out to my newest patrons, C-Movies12, DJ98, Hank Harrison, Night Endo, The Pixar Lamp Dude, and Yaya429. Thank you guys so much for your support. If you enjoy the content I make and would like to offer your support, then for as little as $1 a month, you can get your name listed right here at the start of every video. Link to that is in the description below. Anyway, let's waste no more time, let's just dive right in. Fiddlesticks. Okay, so MGM didn't actually start as a cartoon studio until 1938. However, they did distribute many different cartoons from two separate independent cartoon studios, so we might as well include them here. The first was Iwerks Studio, which was headed by Iwerks, who was one of Disney's earliest animators back in the 1920s. He was in fact the man who directed the now public domain Steamboat Willie. But he and Disney had a falling out, and subsequently he tried to start his own animation studio, which completely flopped within 7 years. And the first cartoon to come out of this was Fiddlesticks, starring Flip the Frog, and also just so happens to be the first ever sound cartoon to be in color. That's not a bad technical achievement for a cartoon studio to have on their resume, especially for their first cartoon. But that's enough background for now. How's the actual cartoon proper? For what it is, and that's more or less just a proof of concept more than anything, it's alright. It's perfectly watchable and enjoyable enough. It's just some bouncy animation and a few standard cartoon sight gags. Flip's a frog. That's his personality. He's there, but he's not annoying, so that's a plus. Really, the most interesting thing about this is the segment where Flip and a mouse character that looks suspiciously similar to another certain mouse character are playing a duet together, and Flip decides to go off and do his own thing, only for the mouse character to lash out against him violently. It's difficult to not draw parallels between this scene and the falling out Iwerks had with Disney. That little bit of reality subtext creeping in makes this a touch more interesting than it otherwise would have been. But yeah, overall, it's fine. Flying Fists. The first Flip cartoon with a plot, I guess? It's basically just a boxing match between Flip and some jerky turtle. There's honestly not really much to say about it. The animation is nice and fluid in that rubber hose kind of way, but that's also kind of the issue here. The rubber hose style lessens the impact of the punches, so the slapstick's not really as funny as it has the potential to be. The most amusing moment is the bit where the boxing ref is trying to count the turtle down, but can't when Flip is standing over his shoulder watching him count. Again, it's alright, but nothing special. Little Orphan Willie. The first of two Flip the Frog cartoons that were made, but MGM never picked up to distribute. Couldn't really tell you why, to be honest. It's not any worse than anything else that they were willing to put their name on. The cartoon actually starts off pretty strong with a mother mouse trying to keep the stork from bringing her yet another baby, stork naked style. And we actually get our first genuinely funny gag in this series, where her chimney ties itself shut. But then once the baby is dropped off at Flip's house, the cartoon turns into kind of a slog where nothing really happens, and then it abruptly ends on this image. Okay. Puddle Pranks. The second Flip cartoon that MGM chose not to pick up for distribution. And this one, you can kind of see why. This one's a typical guy goes a-courtin' and takes his girl out for a date cartoon. I mean, the animation is still nice, but there's not really any jokes or mileage one could conceivably get out of this. The only really interesting thing is that this black pelican thing actually eats this bug character, and that bug stays dead. He never reappears for the rest of the cartoon. That's a surprisingly dark moment in what's ostensibly a bright, cheerful cartoon. The Village Barber. I just want to point out here that Flip the Frog literally cuts off a sleeping cat's tail here just so he can get one of those red and white pole things in front of his barber shop. Man, early cartoon characters were downright cruel to animals that were just minding their own business. Anyway, this is another one that's just fine. Iwerks continues to have good animation movement and rhythm, but the gags just aren't there. This is still perfectly watchable, inoffensive fluff. The Cuckoo Murder Case. Man, talk about a real shot of energy. This was actually genuinely good. I find that when old school cartoons, particularly ones that are in black and white, try to tell more spooky cartoons, they're generally very successful at it, and this is no exception. The opening shot in this actually gave me chills, and the idea of someone murdering the cuckoo bird in a clock just feels right for a cartoon. It's silly enough that it doesn't become too scary for kids, but it does still provide the catalyst for the murder mystery. Plus, there are some genuinely good gags in here. Now, some of the cutesier elements of the typical Flip the Frog cartoons don't mesh with the creepier elements, and the ending is, once again, too abrupt, but that doesn't detract too much from what's otherwise a pretty good, solid cartoon. The Soup Song. So, of course, once Iwerks proved that he could do something new and fresh and exciting with Flip the Frog, he immediately reverts back to his old ways.
Yippee!
Good animation, movement, and rhythm is only going to get you so far, and Iwerks is going to have to start stepping these up, or at least throw in some funny gags to compensate for that, because this is already starting to get old. The Village Smitty. What did I just get through saying? Man, it's like you're not even listening to me, Iwerks. Okay, to be fair, this one has a little bit more imagination than the last one. And at least this one's more focused than the previous one, but there's still nothing particularly noteworthy about this one. I guess except that instead of that frog girl he was courting in Puddle Pranks, now Flip is smitten with a cat this time. So I guess, hooray for an interspecies romance. Laughing Gas. This is one where the idea alone is strong enough to carry this thing through. Flip the Frog is a dentist and his patient is a walrus who's scared of the dentist. The jokes practically write themselves. This is the first cartoon of the bunch that understands cartoon comedy is at its funniest when there's some form of suffering involved. Here, the walrus is actually afraid and in pain, and that helps punctuate the timing. It's not completely polished, but this is a big step in the right direction. Ragtime Romeo. So the same female cat that was in the Village Smitty is now Flip's girlfriend? It wasn't just a one-off? You know what? I actually like that. I like that Flip's reoccurring girlfriend isn't just of the same species as him. It's just something that you don't expect for 1930s animation. Also, there's this surprisingly risque joke where the photo of Flip is watching his girlfriend undress. This actually made me laugh out loud, and the rest of the special is actually pretty good. There's something surprisingly nice about a community that just comes together spontaneously because of someone playing music for his girlfriend. Except, of course, for some old cow, no, that's not a derogatory term, that's actually what she is, who tries to spoil everyone's fun because she's lonely and miserable. Wow, what a cowin'. And the cartoon ends on a surprising downer, which I wasn't expecting, but I also kind of like it because of how unexpected it was. Anyway, it's cute. I like it. The New Car. You know, for an old-time cartoon series, Flip the Frog has managed to go a whopping 10 cartoons without having any kind of racial stereotype in it. I wonder when the shoe will finally drop. Oh, there it is. To be fair, he's not in this for long, but yeah. On the plus side, this cartoon contains the first instance I've ever seen of a cartoon car licking someone's leg. Wait, that's not a plus side either. Anyway, this one's just weird. This one features a stoplight that encourages drivers to drag race, a flamboyant cop, Flip literally spanking his car, and the car itself getting drunk on alcohol and going for a drive. I don't necessarily know if this is good, but I am endlessly fascinated by this one. This cartoon is paced like a drunk man single-handedly made it, and I'm still not completely convinced Iwerks was sober when he came up with some of this stuff. Stormy Seas. I love a good old-fashioned black and white storm cartoon. This is actually what I wanted Bosco's Shipwreck to be. We have the entire thing be about a storm at sea. This is pure 1930s animated insanity. Some of this imagery is downright demented and chaotic, like even more so than usual. I mean, there's a shot of a satanic Poseidon pulling a ship down to the bottom of the sea. That's just really creative. And then it ends with Flip and his cat girlfriend doing this. I mean, they were literally just kissing and then climbed into someone else's pants for a little bit more privacy. What exactly am I supposed to take away from this? Movie Mad. Now we're back towards more business as usual cartoons. This is kind of your standard main character is trying to sneak past a guard to get somewhere he's not supposed to be kind of cartoon plot, with some pop cultural references of the era thrown into the mix. It's not bad, it's just kind of there. The Village Specialist. Why does this lady have a random suit of armor just laying around her house? I know this is a cartoon, but still, I would like an explanation for that, please. Anyway, this is mostly standard stuff, but it's good standard. The gags are fine without really being funny, the scrappy mangy cat character is kind of fun, and it all builds to a fun enough climax. Jailbirds. With this one, I did like the opening bit of the prisoners trying to walk out, only to pretend that they were merely looking for more rocks to smash. But aside from that, this one's pretty weak. The ideas for the gags aren't bad, but something about the execution of them just feels off. Like the material's not as punchy as it should be. maybe it's because this pales in comparison to something like the incredibly funny Big House Bunny, but the energy of this one just seems missing. Africa Squeaks. Well, with a title like that, I am absolutely certain that we are going to get something nice and squeaky clean and, oh look, some African cannibals. How nice of Iwerks to throw in some much needed racial diversity in his cartoons. But it is kind of odd for them to be called cannibals now that I think of it. I mean, can they really be cannibals if they're just trying to eat a frog and they're, not frogs? Okay, let's try to be fair here. The racial stereotyping is not as bad as some of the worst I've seen. So, hooray for small blessings, I suppose. And the animation is still good. There's also this really odd bit where this giraffe is getting a little too much into licking Flip. I'm certainly not going to forget that image. But honestly, irrespective of the racial stereotyping, there's not really that much in here. It's just kind of bland and generic. At least Jungle Jitters, for as so much worse as the racial stereotyping was in that one, had personality. This one really doesn't, and I feel like it's going to mostly just blend in with the other African hunt cartoons that I've seen. Spooks. This is usually pointed to as the very best of the Flip the Frog cartoons. And based on what I've seen so far, it's hard to disagree. From a skeleton eating a bone and then the shards falling out of his ribcage, to Flip trying to dance with a skeleton woman, to the image of the skeleton holding a knife while laughing maniacally over a tied-up Flip, this one's just a lot of fun and memorable. I would have liked it a bit more if it leaned more heavily into the dark gothic ambiance that such a premise is begging for, but what we get is actually pretty good. As previously mentioned, it's hard to go wrong when it's old-fashioned black and white animation doing skeleton antics. Those rarely miss. Fire Fire. Yeah, we're right back into standard territory. Of all the ones that have been made so far, this one seems the most autopilot-y. I did like this gag where Flip mistakes an elephant's trunk with a fire hose, and the ending where Flip accidentally gets mistaken for a pervert, but that's really about it. Like, what is this moment? The timing of this bit in particular just feels off. I guess this is fine for what it is, but this isn't all that fresh or exciting. It just kind of feels like a case of been there, done that. The Milkman. Starts off good with a few solid gags, like the dairy cow getting all gussied up to be milked, and Flip trying to fight off a fly. And the punchline that he's carried away by flies on a stretcher is a good bit. But then in the second half, Flip and his horse have to deal with a spoiled kid who is thoroughly detestable. I'm serious, this annoying brat makes Wilbur from the Bosco and Honey cartoons look like Charlie Bucket in comparison. So, yeah, watch the first half, but only finish the second half if you're curious. And in case you needed a reminder that these Flip the Frog cartoons were made prior to the Hays Code being established, one line of dialogue actually uses the word hell as a profanity. I want you to keep that these are pre-code cartoons and mine. It's going to be important later. What a Life. This one starts off with Flip and what I think is supposed to be an older version of the kid from The Milkman, asking some homeless bums for spare change right in the middle of the Great Depression. That's a good start. But then it starts to pick up some steam slowly but surely before ending on one of the funniest punchlines I've seen in these cartoons so far. Not only is it funny, but it's a joke that has layers on top of itself. So even once you think the joke is over, there's another one that builds on it. It's a great bit, and that one scene alone makes this one worth watching. Puppy Love. You know, after Iwerks was able to tell a joke as good as the one in What a Life, I was hoping maybe the jokes would start improving. Instead, it gets followed up with this completely passionless bit of dullness. Flip is barely in this. Instead, most of the action is relegated to his dog, a Pluto/Bruno clone that we haven't seen before, and the gags just feel obligatory. It's not painful to sit through, but it is aggressively mediocre. It doesn't offer a single original or fresh moment. School Days. Why are all the other classmates humans while Flip is not only the only frog, he's also the only non-human? Does the teacher allow him in the class only because he knows how to play the piano? Anyway, this is the basic Mary Had a Little Lamb story. Flip has to go to school, but the dog wants to come too and manages to follow him to school one day. Aside from this quick and shockingly risque magazine joke, there's not a whole lot here. The Bully. This is one where the ideas found within are funnier than the execution of said ideas. Like, the idea that Flip's soul is literally punched out of him is a funny idea, but it's a bit too belabored and stretched out to actually get the laugh that it wants. There's also this bit where Flip just straight up hits his opponent over the head with a baseball bat in the ring. It's the same problem. The idea for the joke is funnier than the execution of said joke. Still, this one's creative and amusing enough to say that I marginally enjoyed it. But man, I wish this one was better. The Office Boy. And now Iwerks unleashes his inner Frank Tashlin with this hound dog cartoon. Like, seriously, the whole entire plot is basically subjecting this poor woman to more or less every single form of sexual harassment I could possibly think of. Maybe Iwerks was trying to make a commentary about how hard women have it in the workplace and how they're often subjected to sexual harassment from their male coworkers and boss. I mean, probably not, since she doesn't really have much of a personality beyond being an attractive woman. This is another one of those that isn't really funny, but it constantly had my attention, if for nothing else other than amazement at the sheer audacity of it. Room Runners. There seems to be a deliberate attempt at giving Flip more of a personality here. In this cartoon, he's actively trying to get out of paying for his hotel bill, a plot that would have been cathartic to the Depression-era audience of the time, and honestly wouldn't have been out of place in a Charlie Chaplin tramp movie. So they're kind of going for a lovable scamp with him, at least for this one, and I appreciate the attempt at trying to build some characterization out of what's been a pretty flat character. And then there's the sex jokes. I may have jumped the gun by calling the last one Hound Dog, because here, the horniness has been up to 11. Flip is an unabashed peeping Tom, and we even get some kinda sorta nudity here. Yeah, I knew some of these cartoons were made before the Hayes office was established, but my word, I never expected some of these jokes to be in old-fashioned black and white cartoons. This is bawdy and full of energy. It's not super coherent, and Porky Pig's Feet would do the same basic setup better, but for what it is, this is enjoyable and a curious piece of history. Circus. Very original title there, don't strain yourself. Okay, now that Iwerks got all that out of his system, we're back to the usual shtick. This is your typical chase cartoon with the standard cartoon gags one would expect out of a chase cartoon at the circus. The most memorable bit is the ending, which has the same ending punchline as Those Were Wonderful Days. Although this one came before it, plus the punchline here was actually set up ahead of time, so that's cool. The only other noteworthy thing is the bit with the hot dog, where Flip is selling fully sentient hot dogs, which is kind of messed up in and of itself, and then the dogs seem to be okay with being sold to patrons, but when one actually gets picked, he panics at the thought of being eaten and tries to get away. Eat your heart out, Seth Rogen. The Goal Rush. This one's a fairly run-of-the-mill football cartoon. Nothing all that special. It's basically the typical thing you would expect, except for the football turning into a literal piglet. That I didn't expect. The Pony Express. It's passable. It's about what you'd expect for an Old West cartoon. A stagecoach gets robbed, and Flip's girlfriend gets abducted by an Indian villain, and he has to save her. The most amusing moment is the bit where the villain initially tries to hold them up by standing in the middle of the road, only to get run over because Flip wasn't paying attention. Also, Flip's human girlfriend character shows that she's not completely useless by doing this to the villain, so she's not just a screaming damsel in distress. So I guess that counts for something. The Music Lesson. Another one where the plot is so stripped down and bare bones that it's little more than an excuse to tell some gags. It's not bad, it's just kind of there. Really, only two things to note. I kind of like how the spinster piano teacher doesn't even acknowledge that Flip's dog has become the metronome. Like, she literally doesn't even question it or do a double take or anything. And the image of Flip's dog being tied to a piano leg at the bottom of a lake and being unable to free it is a much more haunting image than I think the filmmakers intended. Nursemaid. You know, it took me until just now to realize that Flip reminds me in a lot of ways of old school Porky Pig, in that he's so transmutable. One day he could be a school-aged kid, and then another he could be a grown adult. I mention this because this is like the second cartoon where Flip fights a baby, and honestly, this time he was asking for it. Some of this imagery is so twisted and demented that you can't believe what you're seeing. like Flip trying to stick a fishing hook down a baby's throat. It's not particularly cogent, but it gets points through sheer peculiarity. Funny face. This one is good, but it could have been better. Now, for starters, I will say the plot of this one is pretty good. Flip thinks that this girl that he's trying to court rejected him because he's ugly. And it turns out he was right. And so he decides the best course of action is to get a whole new face. Why he would want to chase after someone who's that shallow, I don't know. But anyway, then she gets kidnapped by a nameless tough guy jerk because of course she does. And he has to go and save her. But throughout the course of the fight, he gets his new face literally beaten off of him. So then the girl decides that because Flip actually tried to save her, that she should be with him regardless of how he looks. So there's like an actual character arc in this one. And I definitely appreciate that. Also, I want to remind you that this is the second time that the kidnapped female in these Flip cartoons has actually fought back against her abductor rather than just screaming for help. For all the things this gets right, I do wish it had been a little funnier in the joke department. The gag with the faces on the wall goes on too long, and the bit where Flip starts getting chased by a group of women really doesn't go anywhere or have any sort of payoff. But yeah, in terms of actual storytelling, this is a pretty solid attempt for the time. Cuckoo the Magician. In what I think is supposed to be a parody of The Sheik, Flip's girlfriend gets kidnapped, again, by an Arab Swami, and sold to be added to a harem. Boy, isn't that perfect fodder for a light-hearted chase cartoon. Anyway, this one's kind of just bland and generic. Really, nothing much to say except for the part where Flip disguises himself as part of a harem in order to rescue his girl. Flip's Lunchroom. In some ways, it feels like Iwerks is regressing. Like he put all his ideas into what came before, but is now reduced to just simplifying the plots to nothing more than the basic setup, and just having some basic gags related to it in order to fill a deadline. Nothing's really noteworthy here except this one gag about a man shooting peas into his mouth with a gun. Get it? It's a pea shooter. And the conflict with the robbers simply comes in way too late in the cartoon to have any sort of impact. Technocracked. Flip builds a robot and teaches it how to mow. Yeah, that's about it. Nothing spectacular, but it's got its moments and it's cute. It doesn't really explore the ramifications of Flip more or less creating life and then punishing said life for doing what he said to do. But what did I expect for something that came out in the 30s? Baloney. I guess we're going to continue the trend of Flip starting fights with animals that aren't doing anything to him and are just minding their own business. Although, I guess if there's any time doing that makes sense, it would be in a cartoon about bullfighting. Anyway, this one's alright. I do kinda like this idea of bullfighting being treated like a wrestling match of sorts, and the gags are fine. The ending gag is pretty good, even if it does end the cartoon too abruptly. This is another one where the plot doesn't really make much sense. Like, Flip gets kidnapped by two thugs who appear to know the bullfighter well, given that they'd whispered to him what their plan was. And then the bullfighter goes off to fight the bull, but then when he's knocked out of the stadium, then the two thugs return and throw Flip into the ring to fight the bull? I'm sorry, what? What exactly was the plan here? Were they just gonna throw him in with the bull regardless, but they didn't plan on the bullfighter getting knocked out? Or were they originally just gonna keep him in the bag and then just kill or release him? Am I overthinking this? Probably. Regardless, this is another perfectly serviceable, adequate cartoon. Chinaman's Chance. Let's see. Flip the police frog chases after an Asian stereotype criminal who tries to drown Flip in the sewers, even though Flip's a frog and should be able to swim, and then gets high on opium because Asian. Also, the criminal's name in this is Chow Mein. That is so offensively lazy, I almost have to admire it. Anyway, aside from the racial stereotype gags, this is more or less a typical chase a criminal in the city cartoon. Not really good, but also not really terrible either. This one's on the lower side of meh. The Air Race. Alright, after having done nothing but Flip the Frog cartoons and probably getting bored with the character if we're being honest, Iwerks decided that the time had come to create a whole new character for his studio. Enter Willy Whopper, a kid character whose entire shtick was telling fantastical tall tales to his peers, Mater style. Now this cartoon in particular was the first one they made, although it was never released. Allegedly, MGM was, quote, unhappy with the story element and refused to release it, which I find just bizarre. I've never heard of a studio of this era just flat out refusing to release a finished cartoon because they felt it wasn't any good, especially when there are plenty that are clearly far worse than this one. I'm actually wondering if part of the reason why they didn't release it was because this was a loose remake of the Oswald the Lucky Rabbit cartoon, The Ocean Hop, and they were afraid of potential legal action from Disney, especially with Iwerks having worked on both. Anyway, that's enough background. How's the cartoon proper? It's actually pretty good. I think the framing device for these Willy Whopper cartoons is something of a stroke of genius because the story within doesn't really need to be that consistent since, the entire thing comes from the imagination of a young boy. There's some good gags in here. An absolute psycho airplane pilot who is literally ramming his plane into other planes and actually manages to kill someone. Willy crashes into some live-action stock footage, which is actually pretty ambitious for the time. And there's also this cute visual gag. And I think that's why I enjoyed this one as much as I did. It's deceptively pretty cute, but it's got some real morbid moments if you really think about it. Paleface. Okay, let's go back and see how our froggy friend is doing. Oh, he's in another one of these cartoons. Anyway, this cartoon features Flip and his friends fighting off against the most incompetent group of Indians I've ever seen in a cartoon. I mean, for crying out loud, these ones simply get chased off by some animals. I don't know, I kind of feel like if there's literally any group that shouldn't be defeated by native wildlife, it would be, the Native Americans. As a threat, they're pathetic, and as a joke, they're not funny. It doesn't help that the gags in this one just don't work, and the rubber hose animation is really not a good fit for an Indian raid cartoon. This one's not the most offensive portrayal of Native Americans I've seen, but it's one of the more boring ones I've seen. Soda Squirt. Flip's final cartoon, and it's like they combined two plots that really don't fit together. But they felt like they might as well because they knew it would be his final cartoon. Flip opens up a drugstore, and the grand opening is so massive for some reason that they literally treat it like a red carpet event. And he serves a bunch of Hollywood caricatures, like the Marx Brothers, Mae West, Laurel and Hardy, and Tyrell Davis. Man, how's that for a dated reference? It's not bad, it does at least have some chaotic energy to it, but it's also pretty jumbled. Almost like they were in a let's just throw everything at the wall regardless of structure and pacing kind of mood, which a part of me admires, but at the same time, that doesn't make the final product fully work. It's not really that funny, but it's got some good animation and rhythm to it, which makes for a watchable, if unimpressive, cartoon. But seriously, guys, you couldn't think of a better title than Soda Squirt? Play ball. So here's the first Willy Whopper cartoon that was released. And the very first thing that we see him do is throwing baseballs at some blackface caricatures. Yeah, so a reminder, the air race wasn't considered good enough for release, but this was deemed A-OK according to MGM. Anyway, the problem with this one is that it doesn't really feel like a fantastical tale that Willy Whopper is relaying to his classmates, or to anyone really, but instead the braggadocious nature occurs within the story itself rather than outside of it. So already they've abandoned the basic concept of what these Willy Whopper cartoons should be. And besides that, this is basically a precursor Baseball Bugs, only done not anywhere near as good. Spite Flight. This is basically a reworking of the air race, except this time they added a backstory for why Willy was flying in the first place, which was to win the prize money in order to save his girl's home from being evicted by their evil landlord. The backstory really isn't needed since him telling the tall tale in the original was all the backstory that you needed. Some of the gags are reworked, like this one was done in the original, except the original had blackface and this one didn't. And this bit where St. Peter flips off the airplane pilots is done on the back of Willy's airplane as opposed to just standing on a cloud. I prefer the original overall because I felt that one had more energy to it and more jokes. This one spends too much time on the setup and I think suffers as a result. Still, it's not bad, and many of the strengths from the air race do carry over here. Stratosphere. And now we're in the stretch of Willy Whopper cartoons with Willy's rotund redesign for what he'll look like for the rest of his cartoons. And I actually like this redesign. He looks more visually distinct compared to his original design that just kind of looks like a buddy clone. But onto the cartoon itself. Now this This is more what I'm talking about for what I want these Willy Whopper cartoons to be. A great big dose of insanity that feels like something a little boy would imagine. They just go all out with this concept, and it's paced very well. We get the setup right from the get-go, and then we're rewarded with almost non-stop psychedelic creativity. This shows some real promise for where these cartoons can go from here. Davy Jones' Locker. The first of 2 Willy Whopper cartoons, and the first color cartoon by MGM since Fiddlesticks. I personally would have picked the previous one as Willy's first color cartoon, but what do I know? Anyway, this one's good. Not great, but good. I kind of feel like this one would have benefited from more structure, like not getting distracted by all these side tangents. That way Willy's fight with the pirate at the end could be longer and more fleshed out. Still, it's hard not to get sucked into the creativity that we do get, especially when the colors look this good for this era. Hell's Fire. The second and final colorized Willy Whopper cartoon, which they use for Willy recounting his journey into hell. This one's less about Willy as a character being in hell, but rather is more than an excuse just to tell some surreal gags related to hell, like the flames morphing into objects like a hammer and hitting people. But this concept really isn't pushed as far as it should. For what it is, it's fine, but I think if you're going to tell this story, you need to take more advantage of the locale. This kind of feels like a typical generic, bouncy Flip the Frog cartoon. Also, as a quick aside, it seems like this cartoon took a lot of inspiration from one of Iwerks' old silly symphony cartoons, Hell's Bells. Now, I haven't seen that one yet to confirm it 100%, but it seems pretty likely that some recycling was going on here. I just wanted to quickly mention that just in case it gets brought up in the comments. Robin Hood Jr. So yeah, I could totally buy that a young boy, especially one in the 30s, would fantasize that he was Robin Hood, so that part checks out. And there are some good gags in here, like Marion crushing up a photo of Prince John until it's scrunched up, and then it cuts to the real Prince John whose face looks exactly like the same as the scrunched up photo. Really, there's only one problem here. Willy's voice sounds off in this cartoon.
Just a minute, boys. This is a man's job.
He sounds like a grown man. Like, I get that Robin Hood is supposed to be a man, but in this cartoon, Willy's a young boy imagining that he gets to be Robin Hood, so it feels really out of place. It doesn't subtract from the overall product too much, but man, it's still an unnecessary distraction nonetheless. In Sultan the Sultan. Of the MGM cartoons I've seen so far that are, shall we say, unpalatable to the modern audiences due to being drenched in racial stereotyping, this is probably the one that's the best. This is where I think the framing device actually does a lot of heavy lifting, especially since in this version he's actually telling this story to a classmate while he's supposed to be studying. So if you really wanted to, you could read all the racial stereotype jokes as being a product of Willy's imagination due to his upbringing in this period of time, since it is, in fact, all in his head. Now, is that reading way too much into the subtext? Probably, but that doesn't mean that the subtext isn't there. Regardless, the structure here is a lot more focused compared to some of the other Willy Whopper cartoons. Here, there's a clear goal in mind. Willy has to save Mary, and it doesn't get lost in side tangents. And some of these gags are funny, some of them for no other reason than just the sheer audacity of them. It's well made and sturdy, and I think without the racial stereotype jokes in it, this one would have had the potential to be a classic, or at least as much of a classic as a Willy Whopper cartoon could be. Reducing Creme, aka the one where Willy Whopper tries to make his girl feel bad for making a comment about him being fat. Like, seriously, I'm not exaggerating. She tells Willy that he needs to take some reducing cream in order to lose weight. And then Willy proceeds to tell a story about how not only the reducing cream doesn't work the way that she thinks it does, but also tells a love story between a skinny chef and a fat cook, and how the two of them are very much in love, and her being overweight is not a catalyst for any jokes. That subtext feels 100% intentional, and if it was released today, I would say that it was. But given that this came out in the early 30s, I legitimately don't know if it was. Regardless, this one's weird. It's got some madcap energy and takes just enough advantage of its concept. It's good, if a little bit unfocused. Rasslin' Round. This is another one, like Play Ball, that doesn't really feel like it belongs as a Willy Whopper cartoon, or at least not told like this. This is virtually indistinguishable from pretty much any other wrestling cartoon of the era. The gags aren't really that funny, the running gag involving a heckler in the crowd isn't funny, and ultimately goes nowhere, and it ends kinda anticlimactically instead of building and building like it should. Not absolutely awful, but this is still not very good. The Caveman. I do like this one bit where Willie is hitting a dinosaur on top of his head, and the dinosaur looks more annoyed than anything. Aside from that, this is a fairly standard-of-the-era Tarzan-style cartoon. Not great, but has its moments. The one plus side is that there's no unfortunate racial stereotyping in this one, which makes it unusual for jungle cartoons of this era. Jungle Jitters. Okay, I know this looks bad just based on the title, but you know, just because this cartoon happens to share the exact same title as one of the most infamously racist cartoons of all time, doesn't automatically mean it has to have the same racist caricature. Yeah, okay, never mind. Your first impression was entirely correct. To be fair, these stereotypes aren't as bad as the one in the other Jungle Jitters, which is like the lowest of low bars, but there it is nonetheless. Plus, it does portray Willie having a crush on someone who is not of the same race as him. I think she's of Polynesian descent, which for the early 1930s is actually pretty daring. Granted, she is topless, which is kinda weird, but I mean, it is supposed to be his fantasy, so I guess that's not too far-fetched. Then again, how old is Willie supposed to be? I think I better not ask questions I don't want to know the answer to. And there are a few gags that work. For whatever reason, I love the animation on the skull blowing out smoke. But yeah, once the cannibals show up, the pacing does slow down quite a bit, and it really starts to drag. So it definitely has its issues, but I will give it the stamp of not as bad as the other Jungle Jitters. The Good Scout. This is one where I really like... Wait, hang on, is that Bosco in the background? Anyway, like I was saying, this is one where I really like the concept, and it takes advantage of the main selling point for this series of Willie telling tall tales and transplanting that onto telling his scoutmaster all the good things he did in order to earn a merit badge. And what I liked here was the exaggeration with his storytelling that he's doing to make himself look better. Like when he says that he fought off a big bully. Here that bully actually is big, as in he's a literal giant. That's really clever. And I don't know why, but I just love it that the cartoon feels the need to establish that the girl that's tied up and gagged in the backseat of the car has been kidnapped by having a piece of paper fly by showing us that she's been kidnapped, as if we couldn't tell that for ourselves. There's also not really a punchline to this entire thing. Like, is the joke supposed to be that the Scoutmaster completely bought his lie? Or is he lying? We're not really given any kind of indication in the cartoon itself that he is. I don't know, it's not really a huge problem, but it does prevent it from being really good. Like, if the ending had been really punchy, it could have been one of the greats. But as is, this is perfectly fine and solid. Viva Willie. The final Willy Whopper cartoon, and the final Iwerks Studio cartoon that was picked up for distribution by MGM. And I gotta admit, it is kind of a shame that Willy Whopper had such a short shelf life and didn't work out. If he'd just been given a little bit more time to bloom into a character and find his footing, maybe establish some rules for how his cartoon should operate, then maybe he could have been one of the classic old school cartoon characters. But as is, we have to settle for just 14 cartoons. And there are some good ones in there. This isn't one of them, sadly. The harmonica gag is kinda cute and has an okay payoff, and I do like this bullet gag, but that's really about it. When I think of a young boy imagining himself in the Old West, I'd expect something a little bit more wild and chaotic than this. This feels kinda underwhelming for what it could have been, and far too much of it is devoted to a gag about Willie's horse getting drunk, and it is nowhere near as funny as the filmmakers think. It's not awful, but you're better off watching the Pony Express. And with that, we bid a fond farewell to Iwerks, at least for now. I expect we'll be seeing you later sometime down the road, and while it is a shame that this didn't work out, you did manage to give us a few solid cartoons out of it, and for that, I am grateful. The Discontented Canary. Rudolph Ising and Hugh Harmon.
Now that's a name I've not heard in a long time.
Yep. After Harmon and Ising parted ways with Warner Brothers, they went over to MGM to start a new series called Happy Harmonies. Man, every company wanted to have their own version of silly symphonies, didn't they? This is also Harmon and Ising's first color cartoon. In fact, all of these Happy Harmonies cartoons are in color, which I'm sure was a major selling point for why MGM picked them up. But anyway, enough background talk. All that really matters is how good the cartoon is. It's okay-ish. This is about typical stuff from the duo. It's cutesy, but also not particularly memorable. It's just kind of your typical cautionary tale about being careful what you wish for and being content with what you have. Nothing more, nothing less. The Old Pioneer. With the Discontented Canary being retroactively considered an unofficial Happy Harmonies, this is the first one that actually calls itself a Happy Harmony cartoon in the title card. Anyway, this one feels like a typical one-shot Harmon and Ising cartoon, although here you do get the novelty of seeing it done in color, which is definitely neat. The gags in this aren't particularly spectacular, but there are some decent jokes about loading and shooting guns. I also like this joke about the old man keeping track of the Indians he's hit, but when his hat gets shot off, the little Indian boy erases one of them. I've seen that joke done before, but having an Indian be the one to erase it just adds an extra layer that just makes it funnier. Overall, this one's enjoyable enough. Nothing great, but solid. Tale of the Vienna Woods. Excuse me, the title of the waltz is actually called Tales from the Vienna Woods? 0 out of 10, worst cartoon of all time. Anyway, all kidding aside, this one's basically a Fantasia segment 6 years before Fantasia was even a thing. A wordless story set to classical music. I admire the attempt, but of course it's hard not to compare it to Fantasia. The animation quality is not quite up to par to be as elegant as it wants to be, and the fact that this is 2-color Technicolor and not, say, 3-strip Technicolor hurts it. For what it is, and for the time period it was released, it's alright. It's basically a fawn and satyr spending time together in the woods. It's nice enough, but that's really all it is. Nice enough. Bosco's Parlor Pranks. Bosco's first appearance in an MGM cartoon. And this one's weird, and I mean that in a different way than I normally do. Because this is basically just a clip show of older Bosco cartoons, except they're in color now. Which is doubly weird because the cartoons they're taking clips from were owned at the time by Warner Brothers, even though this cartoon was distributed by MGM. I don't think I've ever seen a clip show cartoon in which the clips are taken from cartoons that a studio did not own. That seems like brazen copyright infringement. Although in a weird twist of fate, Warner Brothers actually now owns the right to these MGM cartoons through the Turner Entertainment Company, including this one. Life is funny sometimes, isn't it? So, I guess if you ever wanted to see clips from old Bosco cartoons only in color instead of in black and white, this is the one to check out. But aside from it being the first Bosco MGM cartoon, and even that's debatable, this one doesn't have much to offer. Toyland Broadcast. This is basically MGM's answer to Beauty and the Beast or Those Beautiful Dames, except, not good. Yeah, those had childlike whimsy and antics. This one has blackface jokes. Lots and lots of blackface jokes. I think not having a human kid experiencing all these toy antics was a miscalculation, because that adds in some tether to reality and makes the events seem more magical. This is just kinda, oh yeah, I've seen this done before, but done better. The only noteworthy thing about this cartoon is that this is the debut of Lillian Randolph, who you might remember as the voice of Mammy Two Shoes, who would appear in cartoons starring a certain cat and mouse duo that we'll get to next time. Hey Hey Fever, the final cartoon featuring the old design of Bosco before his redesign, which we'll get to in a second. This is basically Bosco singing and dancing his way through a Mother Goose world. There's not really a story or any clever jokes or moments, and even the energy doesn't seem to be contagious. I just wish Harmon and Ising would go beyond their usual bag of tricks. When the Cat's Away. A typical Vermin takes over the kitchen cartoon, except this time the cat isn't really the villain here. In fact, she actually winds up saving the day for the protagonist, which is a nice little subversion. It's got some good cabin backgrounds and a few solid, if unremarkable, gags. Also, some of these designs are uncanny. Like, these rats here are drawn in a more realistic style than a more anthropomorphic style, which kinda ups the ew factor of seeing them eat food in the kitchen. The Lost Chick. Man, when I said that Harmon and Ising needed to evolve past their usual tricks, I didn't expect them to do it so soon. This is probably the first cartoon of theirs that I've seen that actually feels like a complete work. It tells the story about an egg that gets separated from his mother, and two young squirrels, who I assume are orphans because they don't seem to have a mother or father, bring it home thinking it's a giant nut, only for it to hatch and they have to try to raise it. Okay, this isn't exactly groundbreaking stuff, but from this duo, it sure feels like it is. This is one where it mixes Disney-style sentimentality with just a little bit of cruelty and cynicism, and every scene hits the note that it should. It's not brilliant, but credit where it's due, they made something genuinely good here. Very underrated and underappreciated. The Calico Dragon. The very first MGM cartoon to be nominated for an Academy Award for Best Short Subject Cartoons. So this one must be really good, right? I mean, it's got some nice backgrounds. I actually like how the backgrounds are drawn in such a way that they look like they're made of cloth. So that gives us a psychedelic-esque feel to it. So that does give this some level of identity with this being another Toys Come to Life cartoon. But aside from that, yeah, there's still not much to distinguish itself. It's fine, but not necessarily Oscar-worthy. Good Little Monkeys. Satan tries to tempt and corrupt see no evil, speak no evil, and hear no evil monkeys. Get it? It's like a metaphor. And when they try to do the right thing by resisting temptation from a woman trying to seduce them, they still wind up running right into the devil's clutches. Is that supposed to be a commentary about the concept of original sin? Probably not, I just thought I'd point that out. Anyway, there's a lot of creativity with this one. The animation on Satan in particular is really good. And I like that rather than merely being a series of gags in the book characters coming to life genre, there's an attempt at having a plot that runs throughout it. Some good stuff. The Chinese Nightingale. Based on the old Hans Christian Andersen fairy tale, The Nightingale, this cartoon tells a classic story of betrayal, wherein the titular Nightingale feels betrayed that the emperor that he was close to and sang his songs to becomes enamored with a music box and a fake bird instead. There's a surprisingly salient commentary in here about the dangers of mechanization versus the simplicity of nature that gives the story a little bit more meat than I think even the creators themselves are aware of. Not only that, but the nature backgrounds are gorgeous. And you can tell they made a concerted effort to at least try to capture the beauty of outdoors imperial China, at least with the limited budget and resources they had. The big problem here is the emperor himself. Yeah, he's a racial stereotype, but that's really only part of the problem. His design is ugly. And not in an endearing or charming way, he's just grotesque and not pleasant on the eyes in the slightest. He's not even really supposed to be evil or a villain here, so I don't know why they went out of their way to make him look so thoroughly grotesque. Ising had done Chinese characters before in One Step Ahead of My Shadow, and they all look more appealing than he does in this cartoon. So if you can get past that design, which I can understand if you can't, the rest of this is actually really good. This would probably be one of my favorite MGM cartoons so far if it weren't for that hideous character design, which is honestly a real shame. Poor Little Me. Clocking in at a whopping 11 minutes, yes, you heard that right, 11 minutes. This is more or less just cloying cutesy cuteness, or watching a skunk be sad that he has no friends just because he's a skunk and they can't stand being around him. And so the solution is that he needs to just accept that he's not meant to hang out with animals that are not part of his own kind, and just accept that the only place he'll truly belong is his family. Yeah, that's not weird / creepy. Like, I think this was supposed to come across as a heartwarming, your family will always have your back no matter what message, but there's this kind of cruel, almost defeatist undercurrent that kind of drags this thing down into the mud. And for goodness sake, there was no reason this thing needed to be 11 minutes. This thing is padded like crazy to reach that runtime, including a villain character that comes completely out of nowhere just to force an arbitrary climax. I guess the backgrounds continue to be well drawn and pleasant on the eyes, and the friendship between the skunk and the bunny with the cold was kind of adorable while it lasted, but that almost doesn't matter when the story is this poorly constructed and thought out. Barnyard Babies. oh deep joy, we're getting right back into cutesy cloying territory, except they're barely attempting to give this thing some kind of structure or plot. The closest is that an expecting hen and rooster are trying to speed up their eggs getting hatched so that their newborn chicks can be part of the baby contest. But it's not even really the focus. They only appear at the beginning and at the end, with the ending implying that they won the contest even though they didn't participate? Okay, fine, whatever. Can we please get something other than cloying cuteness? Please! Anything else! The old plantation. That is not what I meant! Okay, let's try to be fair here. This is a bizarre mixing of Uncle Tom's Cabin and Black Beauty, and it weirdly kind of works, and the entire thing is given a dollhouse aesthetic. Like, literally, all the characters, the majority of which are slaves, are literal dolls, children's playthings. I'd actually be willing to give credit to the subtext if I thought that was done intentionally. Anyway, the horse race scene in the second half is actually very well done. There's a few decent gags, in particular the little girl trying to get her horse going by using explosives was a real treat. Not only that, but this is actually the first non-Disney Technicolor 3-strip cartoon that was ever made. And so the cartoon does look more, if you'll excuse the pun, colorful compared to the previous ones. Of course, there's the romanticization about a time period that really should not be romanticized, but then again, having a Simon Legree type figure is at the very least an acknowledgement of the evils of slavery to some capacity. It's definitely a product of the time, but as far as those go, it's actually solid and decently constructed. Honeyland. It's bee gags, followed by a chase scene where a spider kidnaps a bee girl, because of course he does, set to the tune of Flight of the Bumblebee. Actually, I do kinda like how the male bee trying to save the girl bee winds up needing to be saved himself by a band of bees. This is fine. It's watchable, nothing to write home about, but it doesn't make any big mistakes either. Alias Saint Nick. I really like the premise of this one. A cat disguises himself as Santa on Christmas Eve in order to try to eat a family of mice. The execution, though, has its problems. Way too much of this cartoon's 10-minute runtime is spent on the mice playing with all the toys that the cat dressed up as Santa gave them for Christmas. Like, once he's in the house, why is he even bothering with the charade? Just eat them. What are you waiting for? There is padding in this, which, again, for a cartoon that's like 2 to 3 minutes longer than your average cartoon of the era, is just mind-boggling. Like I said, the setup to this one's good, and the fight to get rid of the cat is fun, but the padding and overstretched runtime seriously hurts this one a great deal. Run, Sheep, Run. There have been many mistakes throughout all of animation history. Putting Speedy Gonzales and Daffy Duck together, never making a Hank the Cowdog movie, the entirety of Chicken Little. But probably the worst decision in the history of anything was what Hugh Harman decided to do with Bosco. For a reason that I cannot even begin to comprehend, Bosco was redesigned into what I can only describe as a preschool version of Blackface Buddy. Well, I'm completely sold. I literally don't even know what to say. No, seriously, what am I supposed to say to that? I guess I could just talk about the cartoon itself, but what would be the point? This is yet another 10-minute cartoon that is padded like crazy to stretch this thing out well past its breaking point. It kind of seems like it's setting itself up to be a boy who cried wolf kind of story, but no, it's just one of the sheep pretending that something is attacking him, then Bruno dressing up as a bear to scare the sheep, only to have Bosco come running and shooting him, only for them to be chased by what appears to be an actual bear, until it's revealed that it's just the remaining sheep. Oh, and for some reason, this was all a dream that Bosco had. Why? I don't know. I honestly couldn't tell you what the thought process for that was even supposed to be. This entire thing just meanders and wanders to and fro, and by the time it ends, you just feel like you sat through a whole lot of nothing. The bit where Bosco is shooting Bruno in a bear suit is the only time this part comes alive. The rest of this is just so thin and lifeless. Bottles. This cartoon is one half of the typical bouncy fare we've come to expect from Hugh Harman, and the other half is nightmare fuel, in which the skull and crossbones on a bottle of poison comes to life and torments a druggist. I wish the cartoon had picked one or the other because the two halves didn't really connect together all that well, But with all that said, this is really creative and fun, and once it gets to the dark stuff, really twisted. The Early Bird and the Worm. It's funny. Sometimes these guys are capable of something truly good and entertaining, but then other times they revert right back to their old habits. Take a guess which one this is. This is just so bland and so nondescript that there's really nothing to say about it. The Old Mill Pond. It's a frog variety show where they do celebrity impressions. So basically just a not as good version of the Cuckoo Nut Grove and The Woods Are Full of Cuckoos. Also, thankfully, it seems they've worked their way back down to runtimes to a much more reasonable 8 minutes. So there is that. Two Little Pups. Two Little Pups that are basically the two curious puppies from Looney Tunes before they even existed, only not as good. I don't know, like, this is harmless, I suppose, but it's totally lacking in funny moments or imagination. It's just cute for kids, I guess, but there's not really much here to grab you as an adult. The Old House. Oh, now we get to see the Honey redesign. It's just as bad as the Bosco one. But okay, trying to put all that aside, this one actually has a nice, spooky atmosphere to it. Like, seriously, just look at that house and look at these backgrounds and don't tell me that it just oozes fear and dread. And the gags actually mostly work. Like how Bosco and Honey keep mistaking the other for some other ghostly figure, and the way these misunderstandings just keep building and building. And there's this bit where Bruno literally stops dead in his tracks. That actually got a laugh out of me. It's just... man, I wish they'd used the original designs for Bosco and Honey, because had they done so, this could have actually been one of their best shorts. But they do use those hideous redesigns, and it's a constant distraction. Pity. The Pups Picnic. A cartoon that dares ask the question, is two really cute puppies enough to carry a picture? The answer to that is yes. It's perfectly average in every way, and in fact at one point seems to get bored with the puppies and goes off on a tangent about some hounds chasing a fox. But it's usually pretty consistently watchable. How's that for a recommendation? To Spring. The very first cartoon directed by a little-known director, maybe you've heard of him, William Hanna. And man, talk about someone that you can tell was talented from the start. Not only does this cartoon open with an absolutely gorgeous tapestry of nature that's not quite winter and not quite spring, but everything about this just feels so massive. There's this mythic weight to everything we're seeing, like we're getting a real look behind the curtain. It definitely doesn't hurt that this story is all about the colors of spring, and this has some beautiful eye-popping colors courtesy of Technicolor. This is a guy that just has an instinctive understanding of both timing and scale. He took what's really a nothing story, gnomes manufacturing the colors of spring, and managed to turn it into something pretty elegant and charming. Like this is something out of a German fairy tale. This is the closest MGM cartoon I've seen so far where I look at it and think, it really feels like MGM could actually rival Disney. Little Cheeser. Well, after that burst of creativity, we're right back to the typical stuff. But it's on the upper end of the typical stuff. This one starts out as a basic morality tale for the kiddies about the importance of going to bed when you're told, listening to your parents, not listening to your inner devil, all that good stuff. But by the end, it devolves into cartoony anarchy, with some impeccably timed slapstick with the fight between the cat and the mouse, and the fight between the angel and devil. And thankfully, because it ends with its best foot forward, it does leave a positive impression. The Pups Christmas. Those two puppies are back again, and this time they're just reacting to some Christmas presents. That's really about it. It doesn't get any more substantive than that. The entire cartoon is pretty much the kids play with a toy, the puppies react to a toy, bark at it, and then move on to the next one. I guess it's fine for kids, but at this point in time, I expect them to put more effort into their cartoons than this. Circus Days. It starts off as kind of this simple kids at the circus antics, but then once Bruno falls into the flea circus, the cartoon turns on, like a switch has been flipped. I can't say this is good from start to finish because it takes too long to get to that point, but when it gets to this part, it's pretty fun. Also, I'm pretty sure I found the sound effect that they used for the shark's roar in Jaws the Revenge. Swing Wedding. A soft reboot of the Old Mill Pond, to the point of even reusing some of the same jokes. This one's a little bit better because, for one, there's actually a plot tying everything together and gives this some structure. And it seems a little bit tighter, but honestly, it doesn't improve it that much. Bosco's Easter Eggs. Bosco, or rather the minstrel preschool version of him, more so than he already was, decides to celebrate the resurrection of Jesus by stealing some chicken eggs and turning them into Easter eggs. No, just no. But hey, at least they're only flirting with black stereotypes by having him steal chicken eggs instead of the chicken itself. That's gotta count for something, right? Little Old Bosco and the Pirates. Oh, deep joy. Now the Bosco redesign is being paired up with the Jazz Frogs, for some unfathomable reason. It's like Hugh Harmon and Rudolph Ising thought to themselves, wait a minute, Bosco's a black stereotype, and the Jazz Frogs are a black stereotype, so let's combine the two. It's genius! Okay, let's be fair for just a second. This seems like an attempt to get Bosco back into more fever dream territory, with absolutely demented animation, and sometimes it gets the energy right. They hired an actual black kid to voice Bosco this time, Philip Hurlick, which, on the one hand, I'm kinda grateful for, but on the other hand, the voice being ultra cutesy this time just further illustrates that this is clearly not the same Bosco as before, so why even bother calling him Bosco? The Hound and the Rabbit. A generic hound dog and a generic bunny rabbit become generic friends. I do kinda like how the rabbit proves to his rabbit buddies that the hound dog isn't going to eat him by literally putting his own head in the hound's mouth. That being said, I don't know why the fox wastes time playing football with the rabbits instead of just capturing them right then and there, and then lets one of the rabbits go, only for said rabbit to call for his new hound friend to come rescue them. A hound that the fox knows full well is there. This fox might be the dumbest villain in this series of cartoons so far. Oh well, overall this one's fine enough. It managed to have some cute moments without getting treacly, and there are some tinges of cruelty to help balance things out. The Wayward Pups. This is easily the best of the two little pup shorts, and fittingly enough, it's also their last short. I think it works here where the others didn't as well, was because here, the pups are actually put in one dangerous situation after another. They're not just reacting at something innocuous and then barking at it. And I also really like that the cat character isn't just one-note evil. He actually feels bad about the puppies not coming home and goes out looking for them and even rescues them from danger. It's actually kind of nice and it makes this cartoon stand out. Although, yes, it is distracting that the cat talks like Donald Duck for some reason. Little Old Bosco and the Cannibals. Well, with a title like that, I can't possibly see how this one could go wrong. Okay, in all fairness, this one's actually not too bad. For one, the parts of the cannibals are played by the Jazz Frogs, which, while yes, are black stereotypes, are the most palatable of the black stereotypes from Harmon and Ising. And even then, the cartoon makes it pretty clear that they're not after Bosco in and of itself, they want the cookies that he's supposed to be taking to his grandmother. And given that this is something he's imagining as he makes his way to his grandmother's house, you could actually make the argument that Bosco is trying to resist the temptation of eating them himself before he gets there. And it's got some real energy about it. Had this been shorter and the fat trimmed, and if it actually had a solid ending punchline rather than just stopping, this might have actually had a chance at working. Little Buck Cheeser. Little Cheeser is back, this time doing a slight Buck Rogers spoof. This is one of those cartoons that's perfectly fine for what it is, and that's about it. It doesn't really go beyond what's expected of it. Once the tension starts building, it more or less just stops, revealing that it was all a dream, and apparently the lesson he was supposed to learn from said dream is that he should say his bedtime prayers. I don't really see the connection here, and the moral feels kinda tacked on. Little Old Bosco in Baghdad. And now, the real final Bosco cartoon, and his last appearance for 52 years, as well as the last Harmon Ising Productions cartoon that they produced specifically for MGM. We're going to get to that in a second. And this is actually not too bad. Actually, it's pretty enjoyable. If for no other reason, this one is so thoroughly unhinged. Like, look at this castor oil. Look at how it's animated. It really does look as disgusting to the audience as it does to Bosco. Granted, I think it is kind of weird that Harmon and Ising really tried to make Bosco is taking cookies to his grandmother and daydreams on his way over into a reoccurring plot, which I find odd that they believed that they were going to be able to get so much mileage out of it. Although, since each of the cartoons got better than the previous one, maybe they were onto something. I still don't understand why they didn't just create a new character from scratch instead of co-opting another one, but nevertheless, they did, and now his run is officially over. Goodbye, Bosco. It's been, well, I'm not going to say pleasant or fun, but it's been real. Pipe dreams. So this is going to require some backstory on what this and the next cartoon are. So after Harmon and Ising went way over budget on their Happy Harmony series in 1937, MGM fired them and decided from there on in that they were going to have their own in-house animation studio instead of simply outsourcing it somewhere else. We'll get to those cartoons in a second, but in the meantime, Harmon and Ising were looking for freelance work, and wouldn't you know it, Walt Disney just so happened to need extra hands on his way behind schedule production of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. So they made a deal that Harmon and Ising would loan Disney some of their animators to try to finish the film on time, and in exchange, Disney would commission Harmon and Ising themselves for 3 cartoons that would be released under the Disney banner. One of these 3 cartoons was actually released by Disney called Merbabies. The other 2, on the other hand, were not. Disney reneged on the deal after RKO Radio Pictures refused to distribute them. So MGM agreed to purchase the 2 completed cartoons that Disney wouldn't take, and at the same time agreed to hire Harmon and Ising back to work in their new in-house animation studio rather than working as outsourced contractors. That's a simplification, but that's more than enough backstory for the purposes of this video. But the real question is, how is the actual cartoon? Well, the monkeys from Good Little Monkeys are back, and this time they actually get themselves into trouble by smoking a pipe and hallucinating the tobacco products coming to life. It's not bad, but it's certainly not very good either. It's not really as creative as the premise seems to indicate that it should be. There are so many other, better products come to life cartoons. And as far as anti-smoking cartoons go, Holy Smoke, which came out the same year, was leagues above this. The Little Bantam Weight, the official final cartoon of the Happy Harmonies series, even if it wasn't originally intended to be. And it's actually one of their better cartoons. You can definitely feel the effort put into this one. Like Harmon and Ising both realized they needed to step up their game if they wanted to release something under Disney's name. And that extra effort doesn't go unnoticed. The designs are good, it's got some good timing, and even a few decently funny moments. Granted, the story isn't that complex, and it is one that we've seen before, but it's a fun time, and one worth checking out if you haven't seen it yet. An Optical Poem. This one, I was debating whether or not I should even include it. In fact, I'm still debating whether or not I should include this in my final ranking or give it some kind of special designation. Because, put simply, this isn't really a cartoon in the way the other ones in the series are. An Optical Poem is just that. It's a piece of avant-garde abstract filmmaking that seeks to put image to what we visualize in our mind while listening to music. In this case, Liszt's Second Hungarian Rhapsody, which should be familiar to you if you're at all familiar with the controversy surrounding both Rhapsody Rabbit and the Cat Concerto. But we'll get to that when we get to that. Right now, let's focus on this one. If there's anything that this cartoon can be compared to, it would be the opening of Fantasia, which would come out 2 years later, but this one did it first. And I would bet the Fantasia artists were heavily inspired by this short, and it's not hard to see why. This special was directed by Oskar Fischinger, an artist newly immigrated to the United States from Germany, who'd previously done work on the backgrounds for the adventures of Prince Ahmed, and was interested in making an abstract work that mirrored his Buddhist-inspired beliefs that all images make a sound. MGM, wanting something a little bit more artistic to play in front of their more prestige films, hired him to produce a single cartoon that could be considered high art. One of the best animated shorts ever made, if you will. Then MGM, after the response wasn't as strong as they wanted, probably because at the time it was so different from everyone was used to that nobody knew what to make of it, decided not to pursue abstract animation going forward. although Fish-Singer likely wouldn't have been eager to work for them again anyway, after they screwed him out of the money that they owed him thanks to that old Hollywood accounting trick, which then led to Fish-Singer demanding he be paid what he was owed, getting physically attacked by one of the accountants, and then he defended himself from said attack with force, but Fish-Singer was the one who wound up getting arrested for assault. And keep in mind, this happened on the day his wife was in the hospital giving birth to their son. Again, this has nothing to do with the cartoon, but the history behind this was too fascinating not to share. Seriously, if there's not a film about this guy's life yet, somebody needs to get on that. Anyway, as for the short itself, it's simply a magnificent work of art. Every single movement of the dots feels very carefully placed and thought out. There's a real rhythm to it, almost to the point that it's hypnotizing. And as the musical piece builds and builds, the dots become more frequent and frenzied, but still deliberate and calculated. It's just a work of art, plain and simple. And as the title says, makes an argument for poetry being more than just words, but it can also involve imagery. Even if you're not a fan of more abstract art or experimental filmmaking, it's still worth checking out. It's only 7 minutes long, and plus, you'll get to hear some awesome classical music, which is always a plus. Cleaning House. Alright, now we're getting into the cartoons that were actually made by MGM themselves, made in their own brand new in-house studio. And they kick things off by making a series of The Captain and the Kids cartoons, which is an adaptation of a comic strip of the same name that I had never heard of, and was such a failure that it only lasted 15 cartoons and was canned in under a year. Well, I'm sold. Like I said, the main reason for this shift was as a way to save money, especially with Happy Harmonies going over budget. So what was the solution to that problem? Well, the Technicolor is gone, for now at least. The animation quality seems like it's 5 years out of date. The dialogue and sound editing is atrocious. Characters are either shouting or muttering their lines, and the pacing and timing is all off. They literally have a W.C. Fields caricature playing with a Charlie McCarthy-style ventriloquist puppet. There is absolutely no payoff to it, it's just there for the sake of being there. This one actively annoyed me and is just noise and thinks that manic energy in and of itself is enough to make everything come together. Okay, that's 1 down, 14 to go. Blue Monday. This one is not nearly as bad as the first one. Still not good, but at least this one didn't actively irritate me, which was nice. This one seems to have a little bit more focus, except for a dire opening third devoted solely to the captain just trying to get out of bed. This is just a basic, exhausted housewife gets fed up with her husband's berating her housework, and so relegates all the chores to him, only for him to realize that it's a lot harder than it looks plot. It's a standard plot that's ruined by a couple of things. The biggest problem is the absolutely horrendous slow pacing, which actually means this kind of has the opposite problem of Cleaning House. Actually, why was this one called Blue Monday and the other one Cleaning House? Did they get the titles mixed up or something? Anyway, the other problem is that this just isn't funny. You already know where the plot is going and it doesn't unfold in an interesting or exciting way. Maybe, just maybe, these will start finding their footing. They can only go up from here, right? Poultry Pirates. Oh, hi, Friz Freeling. Fancy meeting you here. Yeah, for those who don't know, Warner Brothers mainstay Friz Freeling briefly worked for MGM for 6 months to try to help get MGM's cartoon studio off the ground for an increase in pay. And this was the first cartoon he directed for them. And like the previous one, this one's an improvement over the previous installment, but it's still not good. The timing is still a massive problem here. Not just with pace and flow, but even with the slapstick. There's simply no weight to it, as everything still moves a little bit too rubbery, so it squanders any potential for funny moments. You can tell this was made by someone who actually has experience at directing cartoons of this nature, especially when compared to the first two, but it's still stonewalled by either a lack of budget or time to iron out all the kinks. This is the Captain and the Kids cartoon that's the closest to working, but it still doesn't work. The Captain's Pup. You know, these Captain and the Kid cartoons are bad enough already. Do you really need to stretch these runtimes out to 9 minutes to tell stories that don't need anywhere near that amount of time? For crying out loud, they spend 30 seconds on the dog being scared of the captain's foot. Just riveting stuff here, guys. Admittedly, the ending punchline is pretty funny, but it's a slog in order to get to it. A Day at the Beach. Gags that you've seen before, done better in other cartoons, being acted out by a cast of characters that I don't particularly care for, stretched out to a sluggish 10 minutes instead of the usual 7 to 8 minutes of the era. How many more of these do we have to get through again? What a Lion. Probably the best Captain and the Kids cartoon up to this point. I don't know, I mean, the animation is probably the best of the group so far, but this is yet another case where the pacing is too slow. I don't know what MGM's obsession was with making cartoons that were at least 2 minutes longer than they needed to be. If you have a story that can support that runtime, fine, but these clearly didn't. The Pygmy Hunt. I'm starting to realize why these Captain and the Kids cartoons didn't quite take off. Everything about these are just so lifeless, and I don't know what it is, because the problem goes far beyond just the directors, some of whom are quite talented in their own right. Maybe it could be that the Captain just isn't as interesting of a character as the creators think he is. Like, in theory, he's supposed to be a character that the audience is supposed to want to see be the butt of the joke. But he's not well defined enough that the punishments that he endures are either fun or cathartic. And pretty much the entire joke here is that the dog wants the bone on top of the pygmy's head. The pacing's a little bit better compared to the previous outings, but there's still not really anything interesting or engaging happening on the screen. Old Smokey. Hey, look everyone! I'm on top of Old Smokey! Well, I thought it was funny. Okay, back to business. This is just another absolutely generic, basic firefighting slapstick cartoon. And this one came out the same year as Porky the Fireman, and the difference is simply night and day. And I should note that for a series called The Captain and the Kids sure don't make that many appearances. I mean, not that I'm complaining, but still. Buried Treasure. This one starts off with a stereotypical pirate voice cackling over the title card. And that one moment signifies that this one is going to be the one that they actually put some effort into. And not only does this one not suck, it's actually good. Not great or anything, but good. And given that this was directed by Robert Allen, the same guy that directed the abysmal Cleaning House, I think it's nice knowing that he is indeed capable of making a good, solid product. It's paced well, has a good plot, and some gags that work. The animation is still a little bit too restrictive and rubbery for my taste, but right now I'll take the good where I can get it. The Winning Ticket. Oh, so Long John Silver wasn't just a one-off character in the previous one. They've decided to make him a reoccurring character. Why? I don't know. He was fine as a comic threat in Buried Treasure, but what is the point in bringing this character back? What exactly was cool or interesting about him that would justify this decision? And he stuck with this plot that maybe could work, but the execution is so flat. Not helped by the fact that the animation seems significantly worse here than in the other ones. So it kills any potential for jokes before they even have a chance to get off the ground. The Honduras Hurricane. I don't know, I'm just done with this series. I'm checked out. I'm just not feeling 1 ounce of passion here. It's mostly just a bunch of chaotic manic movement for the sake of it. And Friz Freleng may be a talented director, but he is not Bob Clampett. The Captain's Christmas. So here we get the first Captain and the Kids cartoon in Technicolor. And I will say, having one in color is a welcome change of pace and does brighten the series up a little bit, which is especially fitting since this is a Christmas cartoon and so should be bright and colorful. Even if this story does not make one lick of sense. Like, Long John Silver wants to dress up as Santa and go down the chimney for what reason exactly? Did they ever explain why? And then they spend the last 3 minutes on a poorly sung song that the creators themselves acknowledge is a bad song? Apparently the irony was lost on them. And I still do not understand what the creators' fascination was with making Long John Silver the de facto protagonist of these cartoons, while still being the villain, and not a fun one either. That being said, this is easily the Captain and the Kids cartoon that's the best to look at, and I suppose that has to count for something, especially when I was feeling like I was about to go blind from sensory deprivation. Petunia Natural Park. This one is basically copying the format of Tex Avery's Travelogue parody cartoons over at Warner Brothers. I would complain about that, but at least we're getting something different for once out of this series. There's some surprisingly funny sight gags in this one, and I think the lack of a plot and the lack of Long John Silver really helps bring the humor out. This is what happens when you actually try to be funny. Seal Skinners. This one was the final Captain and the Kids cartoon that was produced by MGM, although not the last one that was released. Regardless, this one just feels like a huge step backwards for this series. We're right back to where this was prior to the Captain's Christmas. This cartoon can't seem to decide who or what the focus actually is, so it just throws all these characters and plots together and hopes for the best. The result is rather disjointed and haphazard and not even amusing, let alone funny. Also, why is the seal established as being a loving wife and mom, but then becomes smitten with Long John Silver dressed as a male seal? You know what? I don't care. This cartoon's not good enough for me to care about little details like that. Okay, just one more to go. You're almost done. Mama's New Hat. And here we go. This one is the final Captain and the Kids cartoon that was released. Honestly, now after watching all 15 of them back to back, I can see why this series didn't even last a year. And it's kind of an interesting choice to end these run of cartoons with the only one where the Captain is reduced to nothing more than a silent cameo. This one's basically a simple chase cartoon. Nothing really too complicated or pretentious about it. The horse wants his hat back, and that's it. It's harmless enough for what it is, but it's still not really that funny. The bit with the boys trying new hats on the horses goes on too long and really isn't funny. And the cartoon just kind of stops without any real resolution or punchline. Also, why is this cartoon called Mama's New Hat when the hat in question is actually a used hat? The title's a complete lie. Alright, that seems like as good a place as any to stop. The very end of the first stage of MGM's in-house studio. MGM's early cartoons were typically not the best, which is to be expected. It takes a while for any studio to really find their footing, especially when you're dealing with a medium that was, at the time, still relatively new. But give MGM some credit, they were able to get cartoons made by a lot of talented artists. Although the downside to that is that some of these cartoons feel kinda samey compared to their competitors. But I also give them credit for being willing to try new things as well. I mean, they did commission an abstract avant-garde cartoon after all. But yeah, a lot of these cartoons I reviewed this time aren't particularly well known to most people. There were a few hidden gems and a few surprisingly bawdy ones that shocked even me, regardless whether they existed pre-code or not. But overall, many of the cartoons had this feel of going through the motions. However, next time is when the studio really starts making an identity all on its own. We're going to have the first appearance of Droopy, albeit before he actually got his name, the first appearance of Tom and Jerry, which I know is what you guys have been waiting for, I know I certainly have, and MGM receiving one of their biggest assets behind the scenes, who would go on to make so many classic cartoons for them. His name? That's right, the man himself, Tex Avery, emigrating over from Warner Brothers after his falling out with Leon Schlesinger. Believe it or not, I'm actually pretty ignorant about his MGM cartoons, so I am really looking forward to experiencing them for the first time. And I guess that's it for now. Thank you so much for watching. Once again, a special thank you to all my beautiful patrons. You guys are amazing. And if you want to be notified of when part 2 comes out, make sure that you're subscribed so that you don't miss it. This is one that you're not going to want to miss. Have a good day, and I'll see you next time.